You hear the bells first. Not distant, not celebratory, but overwhelming. Heavy, bone deep. Each chime rolls through the streets like thunder across stone, echoing off cathedral walls gilded in gold and shadow. The city has stopped. Even the beggars are still. This is no ordinary day. This is a coronation disguised as a wedding. The crowd is vast. Nobles in velvet-lined carriages, commoners pressed shoulder to shoulder, foreign dignitaries cloaked in silks. The scent of burning frankincense clings to the air, thick and intrusive. The sun hangs like a coin above the palace spires, and beneath it, a balcony draped in crimson silk waits like an altar. Then she appears. The bride. She moves as if under glass, slow, deliberate, untouched. A girl dressed in ivory lace so fine it nearly vanishes against her pale skin. Her crown catches the light, but her eyes never rise. She walks as if led to slaughter, not to celebration. You can't see her lips, but you can see her hands. They're clenched so tight, her knuckles bloom white against the fabric of her gown. Behind her, the groom emerges, and the silence spreads like a sickness. He is large, unnaturally so, broad in the face, bloated at the middle, with a gait that suggests old injury or too many nights drunk on power. His smile does not reach his eyes. His gaze lingers too long, and when he takes her hand, gloved, trembling, she flinches. Slightly, instantly. Enough. You feel it then, the fracture. A moment in time splitting apart. They vanish behind cathedral doors. Hours pass. Laughter spills from the halls. Chalices clink. Minstrels sing. But there's something else you hear, subtle at first, like a wrong note in a hymn. A footman whispering behind a curtain. A servant rushing through an antechamber, breath caught in her throat. The music grows louder, as if to cover something. Then it happens. The doors to the bridal chamber burst open. You see her first barefoot staggering. Her veil torn, her lips parted in a silent scream. Her face is wet with something more than tears. And trailing behind her, staining the marble beneath her steps, is shame. A stain no perfume could hide. A stench that silences the room. She has soiled herself. Not in privacy, not in solitude. Here, now, in front of the king's guards, the queen's maids, her own sister. Her gown clings to her thighs, ruined. Her body has betrayed her. Or perhaps it was never hers to begin with. And there, emerging from the doorway, stands the king. Naked, unashamed. A grotesque figure made worse by his calm. His breathing is slow, controlled, as if this humiliation was not a consequence, but a ritual. He stares at the crowd not with horror, but with entitlement. No one moves, no one speaks, because this is not a scandal. This is a monarchy, and it has just revealed its truest face. If this is your first time here, and you believe history should be told with all its pain and truth, then subscribe. If not, leave a comment and explain why stories like this shouldn't be remembered. She was raised behind stone walls where silence was sacred, where windows were narrow, voices soft, and questions unwelcome. A convent child not just in practice but in being. Maria Teresa of Valencia had never seen the world beyond the chapel gates until her 13th year. She had never touched gold, never tasted wine, never heard a man speak her name. They said she was chosen, that her purity was a balm for a kingdom diseased with rebellion. They dressed her in scriptures, educated her in Latin psalms, and taught her to bow before God before ever learning to stand before a mirror. By 15, she could recite entire books of the Old Testament. By 16, she was married to a man 3 decades older than her. Twice widowed, thrice cursed, and called His Holiness in flesh by the priests who feared him. Her body became a contract, her silence the ink that sealed it. Beyond the convent walls, the kingdom rotted. The rivers ran low. The grain was failing. The last rebellion had been drowned in its own blood, and the peasants walked barefoot through streets paved with promises. Dissent was a disease, and the court was its physician, prescribing hangings, exile, and dismemberment to any voice louder than a whisper. But beneath the violence, a hunger stirred, not among the poor, but in the throne itself. The king was no longer a man, if he had ever been one. No portraits painted him the same. In some, he appeared pale and waxy, bloated like a drowned corpse. In others, sharp-eyed and lean, his face too symmetrical, too still. The truth lay somewhere between rumor and report. He rarely appeared in daylight. When he did, his robes were triple-lined, even in the heat. A servant once claimed he saw the king's hand, long skeletal fingers, tipped with blackened nails. He vanished 2 days later. Another swore the king could not stomach cooked food, only raw organ meat. That man was beheaded. The palace denied the whispers, but the whispers became wind. There were older rumors too, from his time as crown prince, long before the throne, of broken bedsheets and bloodless brides, of doctors summoned under moonlight, of a mother who refused to sleep under the same roof once her son reached manhood. But none of this mattered now, because Maria had entered the chapel a girl, and emerged a queen. To the kingdom it was a rebirth, a fresh start, a wedding forged not in affection, but in strategy. The priests sang, the crowds cheered, the bride walked, the king watched. They said he wept during the ceremony. They said it was a sign of love. They didn't see how his tears left no trail on his cheeks. But the people believed what they were told, because they needed to, because when a nation is starving, it eats its own history and calls it faith. Maria was no longer a person. She was a symbol, a banner of virginity flown over a battlefield of lies. And the king, he was the altar. The marriage was meant to be the closing of an old chapter, a silencing of unrest, a ritual purification. Instead, it became a mirror. And in that mirror, the kingdom saw what it had ignored for too long. A crown seated atop decay, a church too holy to speak truth, and a throne occupied not by a king, but by something else entirely. If you're still watching, it means you're not like them. You're not here for fairy tales or golden crowns. You want the truth even when it stinks of blood and rot. Subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if you won't, then scroll down and tell us, why shouldn't we remember what they wanted us to forget? There were things the court physicians would not write on paper, not in official ledgers, not in royal records, not even in their private journals unless written in cipher. Because some truths, once spoken aloud, do not fade, they echo. It began long before Maria. The first whispers came from the eastern wing of the palace. A servant dismissed without notice, a maid found sobbing in the laundry quarters, blood on her apron and silence in her mouth. Then came the midwives, brought in secretly, late at night, for wives who never bore heirs. Each woman young, each woman pale and frail, each woman leaving the palace months later unable to speak of what had happened inside its walls. No one dared say why, until one day one did, a physician by the name of Salazar. Young, brilliant, reckless, summoned to examine the king after his second wife fainted during a private meal. Salazar recorded what he saw in a letter to his mentor in Valencia. That letter never reached its destination. It was intercepted, burned. But not before a copy was made by a trembling scribe. It described a condition so rare, most doubted it could exist. Macrogenitosomia, a congenital overdevelopment of the male genitalia. But this was no simple enlargement. Salazar wrote, "The member is long, yes, but distorted, narrow at its root, bulbous at the head, like a cudgel carved from flesh, cannot perform without pain, perhaps not even then." He went further. His Majesty is not deformed in the sense of the grotesque. He is deformed in the sense of the impossible. The report was buried. Salazar disappeared within a fortnight. But others knew. In the courtyards they told stories of the king's curse. In brothels girls joked, nervously, that they'd rather bed a beast than a bourbon. And in the confessionals of Spain's oldest cathedrals, priests wept as they listened to wives describe wedding nights soaked not in passion, but in blood. One letter, unsigned and torn at the corner, was found decades later in the folds of a tapestry hidden during the civil wars. It read, "I was warned not to scream. I was told to close my eyes. I was told it was holy. But when he touched me, I felt neither God nor man, only rupture, only burning, only silence. Who wrote it? No one knows. But the writing matched that of a queen who died childless and bruised. The monarchy knew, the church knew, the physicians knew, and they all chose silence. Because the kingdom needed an heir. Because the appearance of divine order was more important than the cost in flesh. Because if the truth were known, that the king himself was incapable of normal union, then what claim did his bloodline have to rule? So they buried it. They called his wives fragile. They called his failures spiritual. They blamed infertility on the stars, on curses, on witchcraft. They even whispered that the queens were secretly barren sinners, punished by God for imagined indiscretions. But behind closed doors they experimented. They crafted herbs, potions, oils to numb the pain. They consulted foreign alchemists, desperate for solutions. And when that failed, they tried force. And when force failed, they tried lies. A bishop once wrote, "If His Majesty must bring pain to produce life, then so be it. The blood of women is the soil from which the seed of kings must grow." That bishop was later canonized. Most will click away here, too disturbed to continue. Too comfortable in a world where crowns shine and kings are noble. But if you're still watching, maybe you're one of us, the few who believe that uncovering the grotesque truths of power matters. Subscribe, and carry that burden with echoes of time. If not, the comment section awaits your excuses. The wedding feast had burned long into the evening. Tables groaning under the weight of roasted pheasant and dripping candied fruits. Goblets refilled before they were emptied. Toasts made not to love, but to lineage. The king drank steadily, greedily, though his hands never shook. He laughed when others did, though his eyes remained still. As the final psalms were sung in the candlelit chapel and the choir dissolved into shadow, the guests retired, some to corridors, others to courtesans, but all of them waited. Because what came next was not private. Not really. The bedding ceremony, though shrouded in the language of sanctity, was no less a performance. It had long been tradition for chosen witnesses, courtiers, clergy, noblemen, to gather at a distance, to hear the sheets torn, to wait for the symbol of consummation. The blood, the proof. In a hallway adjacent to the royal bedchamber, they gathered. 10 men of rank, 4 women of court, 2 palace guards, and, unknown to them, 1 foreign diplomat whose report would one day shake a parliament. The queen had been readied by her attendants, her gown unlaced, her skin perfumed, her hands, clasped so tightly in prayer, had to be pried open by her maids. She said nothing. Her lips moved silently, repeating a single phrase, "Holy Mother, hide me." The door closed. What happened next unfolded slowly at first. The king, half drunk and swollen with anticipation, approached her like a predator unfamiliar with his prey. He did not speak. He undressed without ceremony. He stood before her, naked, imposing, breathing heavily, expecting awe. What he received was silence. Not defiance, not resistance, just silence so deep it was offensive. The queen trembled. A servant girl, hidden behind the canopy curtain, later testified to a tribunal. He touched her arm, just once, and she shuddered, not as if it was cold, but as if he had reached inside her. Then the pressure began. His hands moved to her shoulders, down her back. She whispered, "Please," not in invitation, in warning, but he mistook it, or ignored it. He climbed atop her. The bed creaked violently, not with rhythm but resistance. There was a sound, flesh against fabric, knees against wood, gasping. And then, unmistakably, a scream, raw, broken, not from the throat but from somewhere deeper. An animal sound. One of the guards outside the chamber shifted. Another, panicked, reached for the curtain to signal help, but instead of signaling, he pulled. And in one motion, the veil of privacy fell. The witnesses saw everything. They saw the king, hunched and heaving, his back slick with sweat. They saw the queen, pinned beneath him, eyes wide and frozen, her mouth shaped in a silent plea. They saw the sheet beneath her darken. At first they thought it was blood. It wasn't. The air changed. The stench hit them next. She had soiled herself. In terror so complete, so uncontainable, her body collapsed inward. Her bowels emptied. Her legs shook. Her head fell to the side, still conscious, but unable to hold itself up. The king froze. For the first time that night he hesitated. Then rage consumed him. He stood, bellowing, slapping aside a servant who rushed to cover her. He screamed at the guards for interrupting, at the court for watching, at the queen for ruining him. But the damage was done. A foreign diplomat from the Kingdom of Prussia, stationed only a few feet away, recorded in his journal. The queen had not merely shamed herself. She had shamed the very notion of monarchy. For what we saw was not a failure of a woman, but the failure of the throne to protect its bride from the beast it crowned. The queen was carried out wrapped in bedsheets, her face covered. Some said she fainted. Others whispered she remained awake the entire time, motionless. A priest was summoned, not for absolution, but to confirm her virginity, as though that would wash the shame from what had been seen. The palace tried to suppress the story, but the silence came too late. One servant whispered, another repeated. The shame spread like oil across a polished floor. And in the weeks that followed, every corner of the court would feel it. A stain on the crown, a body politic now too aware of its own decay. Because if a queen could not be protected in her bridal bed, then who among them was safe? Most people will pretend this part never happened. They'll skip to the wars, the reforms, the treaties signed with wax and gold. But this is what broke the spell. If you're still here, it means you're brave enough to look directly at what history tried to hide. Subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if not, go on. Scroll down. Explain in the comments why a queen's scream should be forgotten. The palace did not sleep that night. By dawn, tapestries had been taken down, bedsheets burned, servants interrogated, silenced, sent away. The guards who witnessed the scene were separated, stripped of rank, and resworn under threat of exile. Their tongues became property of the crown. The queen had been seen. Her shame smelt. Her body, soiled by terror, had stained more than linen. It had stained the monarchy, and that could not be allowed. So the work of erasure began. The chief court physician, Don Aurelio Damas, was the first to act. He summoned every witness to the physician's hall, each one alone, each one seated under the eyes of 2 armed guards. There they were offered coin, and if coin failed, they were offered silence in another form. One maid, barely 15, refused the money. She was found 3 days later in the convent stables, hanging by a torn veil. Her death was declared spiritual disillusionment. Another, a footman who had merely passed the open door at the wrong moment, was relocated to the northern provinces for personal reflection. He was never seen again, but it was not enough to suppress the truth. It had to be rewritten. The queen, it was said, had suffered from a divine affliction. That night, the priests claimed, was not one of terror, but of exorcism. Her screams were not of fear, but resistance. Her convulsions were not defilement, but deliverance. A Dominican friar, Father Galdos, was chosen to preach the new narrative. In a sermon delivered before the royal court, he proclaimed, "Her Majesty, being so pure, became the battleground for unclean spirits. It is not shame that stained the linens, but victory over the devil." The king, seated stone-faced beside the empty chair of his bride, did not speak. He didn't need to. The church had done what it was designed to do, bend trauma into myth. Still, that wasn't enough. So a painting was commissioned, a new visual gospel. It depicted the wedding night as sacred ritual. The king kneeling beside the bed, eyes turned heavenward. The queen, pale but radiant, hands folded in prayer. No stains, no trembling, no filth, only holy union. Copies of the painting were hung in every royal chapel. Priests instructed children to memorize its meaning. Even the cathedral bells rang once each morning in its honor. But outside the palace, truth seeped through the cracks. A stable boy passed a note to a merchant. A scullery maid whispered to a chimney sweep. And the story, the real one, took root in the mouths of those who had nothing left to lose. Pamphlets appeared in alleyways, printed with woodblocks, dipped in red ink. They depicted a faceless woman, crowned, defiled, kneeling in filth. No words, none needed. Satirical drawings followed. The king, grotesquely oversized, drawn with a serpent's body. The queen drawn with eyes so wide they mirrored the moon. Each was signed with the mark of a ghost, Vox Palatii, the voice of the palace. The art spread faster than the church could smother it. It reached the taverns, the markets, the slums, and soon it reached the nobility, carried in secret behind fans and under sleeves. Meanwhile, the queen vanished. For 3 weeks her chambers remained dark. The windows shuttered. The guards rotated every hour. When asked, the court replied that she was in retreat, devoted to spiritual reflection, fasting for fertility. But behind the walls her condition worsened. Documents hidden in the archives of the royal infirmary, later uncovered during the reign of her successor, revealed the truth. Lacerations, infection, silence. She spoke to no one, not even the priest they forced into her chamber to restore her faith, not even the nurse who changed her bandages by candlelight. Only once did she write, a single line, etched into the underside of her wooden bed frame. If I am holy, why did he bleed me like a lamb? History remembers the victors, but only if we keep the truth alive. They painted her suffering as sanctity. They sang songs over her screams. And today, most have forgotten her name. If you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself, would you let them rewrite this? And if you would, at least have the courage to tell us why in the comments. This was not the first bride. Maria was simply the one the world saw. But there were others, forgotten, buried under marble headstones and layers of sanctified myth. Women who never made it to the altar. Women who vanished between betrothal and coronation. Women who left no letters, only wounds. The earliest was Lady Isabel of Navarre, betrothed to the king when he was still a prince. Barely 20, vibrant, fluent in 4 languages, with a fondness for horses and poetry. Their engagement was announced with pageantry. Within 2 months it was quietly dissolved. No explanation. Her father, a regional duke, received a title upgrade and a tract of land far from court. Isabel, they said, had fallen ill from nerves. She was last seen limping as she boarded a carriage bound for a distant convent. She died there less than a year later. No visitors, no ceremony. The death certificate read, internal rupture, cause unknown. She was 16. Then came Renata of the Rhine, a Lutheran noblewoman chosen to forge an alliance with the Protestant North. Beautiful, educated, and politically savvy, she was invited to court under the pretense of negotiations. She stayed 3 nights. On the 4th morning, her chambermaids found her bleeding on the marble floor. She survived, but just barely. Her father, enraged, demanded annulment. The court denied it had ever been an engagement at all. Renata was labeled unstable. Her journal confiscated. Her only surviving note read, "He laughed when I cried. He said it was the sound of loyalty." And there were more. Whispers. Countless names etched in the margins of letters, spoken only at firesides by women who were taught never to speak too loudly. Brides whose names never made the history books, only the death rolls. There were rumors of a hidden chamber. Not the royal bedchamber, but one beneath it. A stone room accessible through a narrow corridor behind the apothecary's stairwell. 3 servants confirmed its existence before they were reassigned to colonial holdings. One stable master claimed he'd seen noblewomen ushered there, dressed in silk and fear. The room, it was said, held no furniture, only chains. The whispers grew over the years, that the king's desires were not of flesh, but of power. That he sought not intimacy, but the obliteration of will. That what he demanded from his brides was not affection, but submission so complete, it could only be proven through degradation. There were no lovers in his life, only subjects. He did not bed women, he conquered them. And once they were broken, he lost interest. This was not lust. This was ritual, a mirror of his monarchy, because for him, every act of intimacy was a simulation of rule. A test. Would she kneel? Would she cry? Would she resist? And could he make her stop? Even in private, the king ruled as a tyrant. His throne extended into the bedroom, where sheets replaced scepters, and screams stood in for ceremony. He once told a bishop during confession, words later leaked by a penitent servant. It is not her pleasure I require. It is her silence, her stillness, her surrender. Only then do I know I am king. No one challenged it. The court bowed. The clergy blessed. The physicians stitched the wounds shut and signed their names beneath royal seals. And with each ruined bride, the throne grew heavier, soaked in the blood and breath of women used as instruments of statecraft. A bride's broken body was not a tragedy. It was a measurement, a measure of power, a demonstration to nobles, enemies, even God himself, that the king's will could not only shape kingdoms, but shatter the very bodies of those meant to bear his legacy. If you're disgusted by what you're hearing, good. You should be. Now imagine the women who had to live it. Imagine the ones who didn't survive. Echoes of Time doesn't forget them, and neither should you. Join us, or speak in the comments and explain why you'd rather not. She returned from silence like a ghost from the grave. Flesh still bruised, spirit frayed, but eyes sharpened into something colder than grief. No public statement was made. No apology, no explanation. Only a procession. The queen, pale as winter, was led into the royal gardens a full month after her disappearance. Her dress was blue. Not white, not morning black, but deep, defiant blue, embroidered with gold thread that shimmered beneath the morning sun. But the embroidery was not floral. It was language. Woven into the hem, too small to be seen from a distance, were 3 Latin words. Non tecibo amplius. I will no longer be silent. A seamstress later confessed under interrogation that the queen had requested the thread herself, specifying the placement, the color, the font. The seamstress was dismissed. Her husband, a clerk, vanished the following week. At the next feast, a portrait of the queen was commissioned. She stood beside the king, her hands folded, not in prayer, but in an unfamiliar gesture. 3 fingers extended, 2 folded. To most, it looked ornamental. To those who knew, it was the symbol used by escaped convent girls during the early Reformation. Free in the eyes of no man. The painter was questioned for 6 hours. He denied everything. He died of heart trouble 2 days later, though his apprentice claimed he had been healthy as a bull. The court began to fracture. Noblewomen, once docile and ornamental, began wearing rings on the wrong fingers, sewing charms into their sleeves, whispering scripture passages that had not been approved by the royal catechists. Subtle, careful, until they weren't. One duchess, widowed and well-connected, asked the king at a banquet why the queen no longer attended mass. She never left the palace again. A baroness with ties to the northern border questioned the royal physician about the queen's health records. Her carriage was found overturned in a ravine. No horses, no driver, no body. Then came the queen's letters. We know of them only through fragments, intercepted, censored, redacted. But some were smuggled out. One reached a French noble court, later read aloud in secret by a visiting ambassador. It was brief, written in the queen's hand, folded 6 times and sealed with wax from her own bedside candle. If you hear of my death, do not believe illness. If you hear of my madness, know it was grief. And if you hear nothing at all, know it was the crown. The recipient, a duchess known for her Protestant sympathies, fled France within a month. What began as survival became strategy. The queen's bedroom became a battleground, not of flesh, but of information. She used her ladies-in-waiting as couriers, her embroidery as cipher, her silence as a weapon. She could not raise a sword, but she could raise doubt. She began refusing to attend court events, refused to kneel beside the king during prayer, refused to speak in Latin, choosing instead the native tongue of her mother. a language the court detested. Each act small, each act dangerous, but each one planted a crack in the throne. She had learned the rules of power, not from scrolls but from pain. She knew now that kings did not rule through love or loyalty. They ruled through fear and silence. But fear she understood, and silence she had survived it, so she turned them both against him. If you're still here, then you already understand. Some wars are not waged with armies. Some rebellions begin with thread and ink and whispers behind closed doors. Echoes of Time tells their stories. The ones carved in bruises, stitched in silence, and buried in history's shadow. Subscribe now, and if you won't, then explain below why a queen's resistance should go unheard. It came as a whisper first, as all royal executions do. Not death by blade, no, not yet, but death by accusation. They said she was barren, that after a year of marriage her womb remained empty. They said she was cursed, that her blood ran cold with foreign spells, that her silence was not grief, but calculation, that her eyes, so calm, were the eyes of a traitor. The court called it justice, but it was a spectacle, a stage carved from marble, soaked in incense, lit by torches so bright they burned the truth out of the air. The queen, draped in gray, not mourning, not regal, stood alone before the tribunal. 3 bishops, 2 nobles, and the king, seated behind a gold-embroidered curtain, watching. The charges were read: infertility, witchcraft, treason by silence, each charge more absurd than the last, yet each delivered with solemn precision, as if speaking lies in Latin made them holy. She was not allowed counsel. She was not allowed witnesses. She was not even allowed to stand on the dais. Her platform was lowered by design, her voice forced to rise up, as though pleading. But then, she spoke, not in Latin, in the tongue of the common people. And what she said could not be drowned, nor denied. She did not defend herself. She did not plead for mercy. She testified to what he did on their wedding night, to the bruises charted on her thighs, to the nights she was summoned to his chamber and left limping, to the physicians who swore her bleeding was normal, to the priest who told her silence was her salvation, to the women who vanished after asking too many questions, to the chamber beneath the apothecary stairs. She named names. She named every one of them. And then, she unpinned the brooch from her collar. Gold, royal, enamel cracked. Inside was a folded scrap of cloth, soiled, unwashed, stained with the proof of her defilement. Proof preserved not to shame her, but to condemn him. A gasp rose from the court. One bishop fainted. The curtain behind which the king sat trembled. But he did not emerge. The trial never ended, because the crowd outside had heard enough. First came the stone, thrown by a woman in the market, whose own daughter had been taken to the palace and never returned. Then came the gatekeeper who unbarred the palace doors. Then came fire. The people stormed the court. Guards laid down their arms. The king fled through the eastern passage in disguise, robes stuffed under his tunic, his crown buried in a sack of flour. He was never seen in the capital again. The queen vanished that same night, but she did not disappear. 2 years later, in the highlands, a rebel faction emerged, disciplined, organized, funded by a stream of gold traced to foreign banks and hidden vaults, gold that bore the seal once worn on the queen's ring. They marched under a banner stitched with blue and gold, the same blue as the dress she wore the day she reemerged, the same gold thread she used to write, "I will no longer be silent." The dynasty fell within 4 years. The king died in exile, bloated and fevered, whispering into the dark for a wife who never answered. And the queen? She never returned. Her face never carved in marble. Her name never spoken in court histories. But her revolution, the quiet one, outlasted every monument he ever built. If you're still watching, you already know this story isn't about crowns. It's about courage. The kind sewn into hems, hidden in rings, whispered in the dark. The kind that doesn't roar, but survives. Subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if you still choose silence, Then tell us in the comments why you'd let them bury her a second time. They broke the door open with an axe. The key had been lost or hidden or destroyed. No one knew. It took 3 strikes, the final blow splitting the lock clean through, revealing what no servant had entered in over a decade. The king's private chamber. Not his sleeping quarters. Not the official suite with silk sheets and ceremonial robes. This was different. A narrow corridor behind the chapel wall led to a staircase, unlit, choked with dust. At the bottom, a stone door with rusted hinges and no handle. Beyond it, silence. A silence not of peace, but of something left to rot. The air inside was wrong. Heavy. Sour. Sweet in the way meat becomes sweet before it turns. No windows. No candles. And yet, somehow, everything was visible. As if the room itself remembered too clearly. They found trunks first. 6 in total. Each identical. Cedarwood, iron-braced, lined with red velvet faded to brown. Inside, not documents, not relics, not gold, but fabric. Hundreds of garments, undergarments, nightdresses, slips, stained, each one folded, each one labeled with delicate care. Dates, names, initials, some marked simply with an X, some so old the names had faded completely. On one, the queen's crest, embroidered by her own hand, still visible beneath the dark blotch near the hem. One guard retched, another began praying aloud. In the center of the room stood a table, oak, deep-scarred and splintered. Beneath it, a basin, empty, dry, but lined with something darker than rust. On the far wall, paintings, not of saints, not of ancestors, but of her, the queen. Multiple versions. Her face in oil, charcoal, ink. Each one slashed, burned or defaced, as gouged out. Mouth stitched shut in red paint. Crowns painted black. In one, she appeared to be screaming, though the artist had rendered it without sound, only teeth and terror. Beside the paintings hung instruments, not surgical, not ornamental, straps, whips, clamps, hooks, and journals, dozens, lined in goatskin, the pages filled with tight, obsessive script. Descriptions not of names or politics but of sessions, entries catalogued like rituals. She resisted, rewarded her with silence, bled from the thigh, collected the cloth. Stillness achieved after 3rd strike, eyes fixed on ceiling, completion possible. No mention of love, no mention of guilt, only process, only power. This was not the room of a man who had lost control. This was the room of someone who measured it. Every garment, every wound, every scream, catalogued, filed, preserved, not as memory, as method. And in that moment the myth dissolved. The story of the monstrous king, once whispered as rumor, once softened into legend, became something else. It became fact, not an accident, not a curse, but a system, designed, maintained, sanctioned by a crown that knew and chose silence. This isn't just about one king. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked, when shame becomes ceremony, when suffering becomes tradition. The queen soiled herself, but it was the throne that was truly stained. If you feel that history like this must be told, you know what to do. Subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if you still won't, then speak up below. We're listening. In the end, it was not the battlefield that undid the crown. Not the sword, nor the cannon, nor the ink of treaties. It was a sound, a scream, small, high, human, ripped from the throat of a girl who had never known what it meant to say no. History loves its moments of grandeur. It sings of coronations, of empires drawn on parchment, of kings astride horses, casting shadows over continents. But this story did not begin with conquest. It began with a wedding night, a bed, a veil, and a silence that broke open into horror. When she soiled herself, she wasn't just a frightened bride. She was the crack in the wall, the rupture in the illusion. Because monarchies do not fall when armies rise. They fall when their holiness rots from within, and someone finally sees it. That night, every courtier who saw her, every servant, every noble, every diplomat, felt something shift. Not just pity, not just shame, but recognition. Recognition that the divine right of kings was not divine at all. That beneath the robes and rings and incense and oil, there was only flesh. And sometimes that flesh belonged to a monster. Her body betrayed her. Or perhaps, it revealed the truth her voice was not yet allowed to speak. That she was terrified. That she was alone. That she was not a queen, not a bride, not a wife. She was evidence. And evidence does not lie. The court tried to erase it. The church tried to sanctify it. The throne tried to forget it. But the stain never came out. It lingered in the tapestries, in the records, in the corners of portraits no longer displayed. It haunted the eyes of every woman who came after her. Because they knew what that scream meant. It meant the curtain had been pulled too far. It meant the myth had been undone. It meant the people had seen. And once the people see, they do not unsee. Once they hear, they do not forget. That night became legend, not because it was rare, but because it was witnessed. And in the centuries that followed, long after the king had rotted in exile, long after the court had burned and the name of the dynasty had been scrubbed from coins, the image remained. A girl in white, a trembling frame, a stain not of sin, but of survival. That was the legacy. Not bloodlines, not borders, not glory, but the truth. That history turns, not always by force. Sometimes, it turns because a single girl, locked in a golden room, refused to die quietly. So remember her, not because she was royal, but because she was real. Because in the echoes of time, it is not always the battlefield that changes the world. Sometimes, it is a girl, shaking in a royal bed, whose scream still echoes, centuries later. If that echo still reaches you, if you believe it should never fade, subscribe to Echoes of Time, because silence has ruled for too long, and stories like hers deserve to be louder than crowns.